Thank you very much, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and see so many familiar faces, many of whom who have promised to heckle me throughout the next hour. I'll just say, my name is Liz Reynolds, and I'm the Executive Director of MIT's Industrial Performance Center, the IPC. The IPC is an interdisciplinary research center focused on looking at issues of innovation and productivity at the firm, industry, or geographic levels like regions and countries. And Carlos earlier mentioned the importance of translation. That is a role I find at MIT as a non-technologist, non-engineer. I spend a lot of time translating between the engineering technology folks and the other parts of the university. And I think that Carlos's vision of innovation and the process of innovation is one that is very important from my perspective. It's a holistic vision, and it's one that requires all pieces of our academic institutions, but also of our private, public, and nonprofit entities. I also should mention I worked for 5 years for the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City, and have some friends as well here. And so a personal interest for me is how we connect, for those who are local, Kendall Square with Dorchester and Roxbury, and how we bring those worlds together, a very important aspect. So I'm going to introduce our fantastic panel. This is, in fact, the opportunity to get into the details and onto the ground in terms of this question of how we support and foster innovation in cities and metros. I use the term metros whenever Bruce is in the room. And we have a fantastic panel who can talk from Cleveland to Chicago to Boston to beyond on this topic. And I'm preaching to the choir to say that, if innovation is what drives economic development and economic growth, then our cities and metros are the vital engines of that. But it's not enough to have the agglomerations themselves, right? Density, proximity, and talent just by themselves will not do this. It requires the great leaders, it requires the strong institutions, it requires creative collaborations, and it requires an ability to take risk. And we really, I think all of us will know and understand, how risk plays into what cities, neighborhoods, and regions can do. And I think our panel here exhibit all of these qualities in many different ways. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves, give a few minutes of introduction about their respective organizations, and then we'll have a discussion for maybe 30 plus minutes, and then open it up for questions and conversation, because there's so much expertise and experience in this room. We'd like to make sure we bring that into this conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ray from Jumpstart.
Thanks, Liz. So good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I've got lots of friends and mentors in the room, so it's great to see all of you, and I'm sure there's many more mentors in the room for me by the end of the day tomorrow. So my name is Ray Leach. I'm a serial entrepreneur. Never thought I would ever be a social entrepreneur until about 3 years ago, when I realized, I've been doing this for 7 years, and this is really all about social entrepreneurship. I always thought of myself as a for-profit entrepreneur, but for the last 10 years, I've been running a nonprofit organization headquartered in Cleveland called Jumpstart. And Jumpstart was envisioned 10 years ago, really with leadership from the philanthropic community of Cleveland. And then brought the corporate community into the conversation, and ultimately brought the public sector and other leadership of Ohio into our work. But just to give you a quick 3-4 minute background on the last 10 years of work at Jumpstart, is we were founded as think of us as a virtual incubator, an accelerator before Y Combinator even existed. So at the time, Northeast Ohio, obviously going through a very significant generational industrial challenge. Northeast Ohio was known as the worst performing early stage technology entrepreneurship region for 12 years in a row. And so philanthropy really said, you know what, if we're going to ultimately create jobs and opportunities, we've got to really work on this high-tech space, the high-tech or high-growth space. So Jumpstart was founded in 2004, so we're coming up on our 10th anniversary here shortly, and we were focused really to do 3 things. First, to be the champion in the community around entrepreneurship. It had kind of become a 4-letter word, a dirty word in the Rust Belt. If you were an entrepreneur and In Cleveland, that meant you couldn't work with people, and you couldn't get a job with one of the Fortune 34 or Fortune. We had 34 Fortune 500 companies in 1980 in Cleveland. Now we have 9. So really interesting cultural challenges. So the first piece, about 10% of our work was on culture, networking, communication, and then 90% of the work was, half of it was technical assistance, mentoring, coaching to about 100 aspiring high-tech entrepreneurs a year, all for free, delivered by serially successful for-profit entrepreneurs who had a connection, most of them to Ohio. And then investing, an average of about $400,000 in 10 to 15 high-tech startups a year. And $400,000 in 2004, the only way you're going to raise that kind of money is to be the nephew or daughter of a CEO in Cleveland. You're never going to raise that kind of money in Cleveland for a first-time entrepreneur that has a really big vision. So the first 3 years of our operation was totally focused on that. Our initial founding mission statement would read something like, it's our job to not only make Northeast Ohio and Cleveland a national center for innovation and entrepreneurship. That'll probably take us 50 years, but that was our mission. Our vision and our mission was, how do we work with early stage idea owners and aspiring entrepreneurs to help their companies become venture ready? The whole idea that venture capital is going to be a real stimulator to the growth of our economy. So we did that for 3 years, and what was so interesting for me at the time, and we were totally focused on that, is we started to have funders come to us and say, we're encouraged by what Jumpstart is doing, but we've been funding a whole bunch of other things for quite some period of time, and we're less encouraged about what they're doing. Is there a way that you could connect and interconnect to many other nonprofits, tech transfer, commercialization activities in a region of Northeast Ohio, which is 4.5 million people? So it has 7 cities of over 80,000 people, so it's kind of an unusual place. Would you be willing to be kind of an extension of our program management to optimize and build an innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem, or help to build one? And so today, Jumpstart funds 16 other nonprofits in Northeast Ohio that are focused on technology commercialization and innovation. Starting about 3 years ago, in partnership with the U.S. Commerce Department and the White House, they had approached us and asked, it seems like, you've been able to build a public-private, philanthropic, and institutional collective impact strategy for Northeast Ohio. That looks very interesting. It's unusual, especially for a place like Cleveland and Northeast Ohio. Would you be willing to go out into other communities and help leaders in those communities think through what it might take for those leaders to do the same thing? So starting in 2010, Jumpstart originally worked in 6 regions across the country. The original 6 were all in the upper Midwest, and since then we've worked in 9 other regions, most east of the Mississippi, but a lot now in the South, helping the leadership in those communities think in regions, and sometimes it's cities, but most of the times it's regions, think through what could a collective impact strategy be that would leverage the things that we want to do anyway, but if we could come together and leverage each other's competencies, we could get to our ultimate collective goals better, sooner, and faster. So the last piece I'll say, and Jumpstart just finished its 4th kind of update or strategic plan in 10 years, and now really what we're looking at, or what we've learned, is our core competency as an organization is being in the ditch, helping the entrepreneurs, investing in the entrepreneurs, having a lot of interaction with the innovators that are in those communities, as well as leaders of other organizations. How do you do the 444 things you need to get done to build an innovative ecosystem? However, in our national work to date, we've really been more on the theory side than on the practical side. And our presumption was 3 years ago that we had less to offer practically in other places than we might theoretically. And what we've really come to learn is there's a tremendous amount of operating expertise that we can also leverage and benefit to other communities. So now we're getting more involved, not necessarily running programs, but getting into more of the nitty-gritty of, how do you make things happen at the detailed programmatic level. Just as a final point about Cleveland, if Cleveland was the worst large region in Northeast Ohio, or in the country from 1990 to 2002, We've made a tremendous amount of progress. So just to give you an example, last year alone in Cleveland, 67 companies raised venture funding. It was about $1/3 billion just last year. And the organizations, our partners, and the entrepreneurs in Northeast Ohio have raised a couple $2 billion since 2007. And we have about 300 venture-backed companies in Cleveland, where in 2004 we had 9. So that's us.
Hi, my name is John Flavin. I'm the Executive Director of the Chicago Innovation Exchange at the University of Chicago. And like Ray, I'm a serial entrepreneur and investor in the life sciences arena, having started a couple of therapeutics companies in Chicago and taken them from startup through many iterations of growth, and each of those companies took them public and ran them as a public company over several years. My journey into this role, though, really is always straddling between the business side of science and bridging to the scientific operations within those companies that I was building. And a couple of years ago, in addition to starting some life sciences companies in parallel, I took on the role of Executive Director of the Chicago Innovation Mentors Program, which is based and premised on the MIT VMS model here in town. And we focused on building team-based mentoring for faculty coming out of our consortium institutions, which included the University of Chicago, Northwestern, University of Illinois, both in Chicago and Urbana, the Rehab Institute of Chicago, Northern Illinois University, and iBioPropel. And we grew that organization from concept and startup a couple of years ago to now 200 mentors from the community and 70 ventures. And that indicated to me, again, along this journey and pathway of watching Chicago evolve from a predominantly corporate culture, Midwest conservative approach to things, to watching the economy change over the last 10 to 15 years, and policymakers, taking note of that and trying to move more aggressively towards the innovation ecosystem. So, in combination with a shift in individuals' appetites, particularly demographics changing with a younger, more activist student population and faculty who are more attractive to starting businesses around their ideas, Chicago Innovation Mentors in many respects was a response to that increased demand. And again, validating that was and continues to be now with this vibrant organization that focuses on complex R&D. But it's not the only thing happening in the city. In Chicago, which, going back to the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, it's an entrepreneurial city. It's created some world-leading organizations that today are, corporate titans. But like many cities across the country, the demographics have changed. And in the last 10 years, that has accelerated. And underneath and underpinning what has been this corporate conservative population of institutions in town that were cranking out MBAs focused on going to Goldman Sachs or Sears Roebuck and Company or others in town, it's changed dramatically to be in response to students and faculty interested, as I mentioned, in starting businesses around their technologies and ideas. And I think, having been a person that grew up in the Midwest, watching my dad work for Inland Steel for 35 years, but then that industry changing pretty dramatically, always we're looking ahead to see how can we be more innovative and take matters into our own hands. And that's why I started down the entrepreneurial path. But many in my generation were focused on going and working for a large organization because there were plentiful opportunities in town. And so all the institutions trained for those skills, and the whole lifestyle is around building yourself toward being successful in a large organization. But again, as the economy shifted and large impacts to jobs in the city and around the country have changed pretty dramatically, we've seen now a groundswell of emphasis around starting businesses, which is not new to this group, as I know. But setting the groundwork then and the stage for the Chicago Innovation Exchange is this groundswell of excitement and a voracious appetite by students and faculty. I took on the role in September. It's a brand new initiative. University of Chicago, as you may know, is a world-leading institution with multidisciplinary expertises ranging from a world-leading medical center on one end of campus to one of the best business schools in the country, and in between some great life sciences and educational platforms that have been very significant in advancing discoveries in the past. In fact, erythropoietin came out of the labs at the University of Chicago, erythropoietin being the drug that kind of built Amgen. And so a rich history of discovery, but always inwardly focused and more focused on theory and basic research and not so much on the applied. When President Zimmer came on board 7 years ago, he sought to change that, in response to and thinking in advance, to recruit and retain the best students and faculty, innovation and entrepreneurship needs to be at the forefront. So I came on board to lead the Chicago Innovation Exchange with my experience as a hands-on entrepreneur in developing complex R&D enterprises like the ones that I led, but then also learning from what I experienced with Chicago Innovation Mentors, which again has created this validation that there's a deep need for support for complex R&D entrepreneurship in the city. Then fast forwarding to a lot of things happening in the city and being supported by Mayor Emanuel, Governor Quinn, things like 1871, which is a co-working space in the city, has attracted talent, a lot of attention, retention of some of our engineering talent coming out of the University of Illinois Urbana, Northwestern, et cetera, are all forming then this visible acceptance of the entrepreneur rising in stature in Chicago. So entrepreneurship now is the #1 discipline at the Booth School of Business. And it's the same at other institutions, Northwestern, Kellogg School as well. A paradigm shift. And to have world-leading commercialization efforts now that President Zimmer and the university are moving outward to engage with Hyde Park, which has been an economically depressed area, but a strong culture and rich history, and then engaging with the city that is redeveloping itself and looking for the future to build entrepreneurs and innovative companies well into the future with this strong background and a history to draw from. The Innovation Exchange, the 34,000 square foot campus on 53rd Street, which has, again, been an economically depressed area, but the university is working with the city to redevelop the area with the Innovation Center right in the middle of it. So our goal will be, in summary, to catalyze and respond to increased demand by students and faculty coming out of the business school, biological sciences division, physical sciences division, education, computation institute, and then we manage a couple of government laboratories, Argonne National Laboratories, Fermi Lab, as well as the Marine Biological Laboratory out here in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And a rich source of intellectual property, but a strong chasm between where that technology needs to now meet the marketplace. The Chicago Innovation Exchange is about bringing together people that need to be near other people, mentors, venture capitalists, corporate partners. Exposure of these ideas early in their development are critical toward making these ideas move from a technology to a funded product that can make it to the marketplace. So this space will come online in October of next year. We're working knee-deep in programming activities, building partnerships with the outside community, strong support by Mayor Emanuel, President Zimmer, all to make this a big success in the city. So I look forward to sharing more about our activities at the Exchange, but that's our background.
Thank you. You already heard some of the background, but before I tell more, I just want to ask Liz to say what you said when you were right about why you were excited about being here. When Liz arrived, said, this is great, this building is great, but also it's great. It feels like we're here among friends. It feels like this is like informal, and that we're here to have some fun and have some good conversations. So I think, and the other thing is that because this is about practice, it's not an academic conference, which are usually so stuffy, let's put it that way. And in the spirit of being fun, I want to show you what this building can do, since we're a little bit tight on space here. We're going to open that back door. We have a few more extra chairs set up in the back. So let's just do that. Chariots of Fire or Battlestar Galactica. Thank you for that. That was a fun break, which I felt it was necessary. So I already mentioned a little bit about the background about the Venture Café Foundation. I would want to say more about CIC, but the real expert is here, and later he's going to introduce Bruce Katz, and I think he can, Tim Rohan, tell us more about CIC, because I think it's a very relevant story for what we're saying here. But I'm going to focus on the work we do with the Venture Café Foundation, which is a non-profit side of CIC. I mentioned that it has 3 arms. But before I get there, I want to just tell you a little bit about why this is exciting from a historical perspective, personally. I came to Boston 16 years ago, 17, it's crazy. I have developed a love-hate relationship with Boston, which I say because it's probably a very real relationship with Boston, because it's both love and hate. And came with an interest about understanding the role of science and technology in the economy. The word innovation wasn't really there back then. And what I didn't know is that I was coming to a place that actually embodies that idea of the role of innovation in the economy. So I think in that journey there have been 3 elements to what I would want to share about, just tell you about approaches in which we can understand innovation systems in the particular issue of metros and regions. The first one is that we need to understand them. And that is from the MIT element that Teresa, Liz, and I share, and a few others here, that we were out in the field understanding how innovation systems and industries work. And an incredibly important process here is sometimes to reveal and to help those practitioners within an innovation system to take a step back and tell them the story of what they're actually living. My most fun story of that is I was doing some research on innovation in mechanical engineering, and I went to Charlotte, North Carolina, because there was some data that suggested that there was machinery there, and what I found was NASCAR. And turns out it became half of my dissertation. Incredible case study, like a great case study of innovation, full of interesting people, and you have 450 businesses in Charlotte, about 20,000 jobs at least back then. 90% of the teams had actually make the cars there, and all of the financing, the expertise that takes to run races, from the technology to the marketing, and it's just such a great laboratory, and it's almost like watching innovation under a microscope. But when I was there, it was in nobody's radar. It was like this peripheral thing that the people in uptown Charlotte, they wanted to be a banking center. So NASCAR was a little bit just not consistent. Now it's a huge part of the economic development agenda, and I think initially they were a little bit surprised that somebody from MIT would come and be interested in learning about NASCAR. The last part of my research was full access to a race on a weekend in Loudon, New Hampshire, and it was absolutely incredible. It was memorable, one of the best things I've done. So that's understanding. This is to say, if we want to understand this issue, we need to understand. The other is from the policy point of view, which is what does it mean to be a policymaker in these areas of innovation systems. And one is that we need to, again, understand. We can't have all of these theories and these ideas about how to improve these innovation systems, but instead we sometimes need to just go out and be attentive as to what is happening. That's the way here in the state a lot of this work has been done, which is to be really attentive to the micro level in different regions on a project-based level. And finally, right now, as a practitioner, and that's there is a common thread to all this. So as a practitioner right now, in the Venture Café Foundation, what we do is really we create a space. We create spaces and we create opportunities for entrepreneurs, for investors to connect with each other, to come together, for companies to come together. And we create a physical space in the gathering at CIC every Thursday. We have a physical space here under management, which is this gathering and event space for the innovation community with a mission. And finally, we tell stories. And we're still working on what that means. But we really like to tell stories on this about innovation. Now, the buildings for innovation and spaces for innovation are popping up all over the place. Whether it is here in Boston or whether it is in another city in Europe or in the United States. And efforts to connect regions with each other and companies with each other are popping up all over the place. The way we approach this is in a very smart way. Well, I don't mean that we're smart. I mean that we are deeply embedded in the networks here. I mean, all of my colleagues deeply embedded in the networks here in Greater Boston, so that when we're organizing a session on women entrepreneurship and business leaders at the Venture Café, there are key people in our team, like Pardi Safari from the city of Cambridge, who's here, who knows a lot of people in not only, or like, my colleague Andrew Singleton, who's by virtue of having worked on this already knows a lot of these organizations, or Kevin Wyant, who organizes all the mobile technology industry here in Boston. So when somebody comes and says, hey, a company comes and says, hey, we're interested in learning more about marine robotics. Well, you can make a phone call. And what this does is that it really accelerates the process of, I talked about whether innovation is a problem solving or a conversational process. It's both. We learn different things about it when we look at it through different lenses. And I think what we do is we create spaces and opportunities that really accelerate both the problem solving process, meaning that allows people to find the technologies their needs, the investors they need, the business partners they need. And also that where individuals come together to explore and to come together without an agenda. And that is incredibly important and underestimated. Because and it's hard to measure, it's even hard to talk about it because it requires a very different understanding of technology, of knowledge, of reality as a whole of what it is. So it's an interesting tension here that we deal with all the time, which is that on the one hand we want to help people solve problems, on the other hand we want to create these spaces for individuals to come together and talk to each other. So when we're talking about metrics, well, maybe some of the things we can measure, but a lot of these measurements are qualitative, so they're not measurements, they're stories. And they're equally true. The fact that they're not associated with numbers doesn't make them less true. And that's what we try to do really every day in different ways. In this building, in the Venture Café, through our Captains of Innovation and MBI programs, to really build these communities, expand what it means to be an innovator, an entrepreneur, and also to share stories and to tell stories about innovation.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, John and Ray. I think we heard a number of things about what are some of the key ingredients here. Hear about networks, about partnerships, about the space without an agenda. I'd like to get back to, Ray, you started out at one point, you said you're focusing on how do you make things happen? And maybe everyone can comment on this key question of what do you think you're really doing to make things happen, and what have you found to be some of the key challenges for you in doing that?
So I think it's aligning incentives, motivation, passions, figuring out or trying to build a consensus around what are the top 3, 5, 6, 7 things that a group of organizations, individuals, institutions, individually what they want to see happen, and finding out where the intersections are and figuring out who's going to do what to whom to make it real, and can we build a intellectual and a practical environment where no one's worried about taking the credit. If no one's worried about taking the credit for the collective gain, we can make something happen. But if everyone's there worried about, what am I going to own to the market, then that ends up being a real barrier. So this whole thinking, this whole sense of how do you get the right folks in the right rooms with the right incentives, and you don't have to, obviously you can't solve everything. Pick the things that you think you have the greatest opportunity to solve that also generates momentum. Because whether it's storytelling is incredibly important, particularly if you have public-private, philanthropic, and institutional partners. If you're unable to tell stories that tug at the heart, tug at the head, tug at the wallet, you're in trouble. You need to figure that out pretty quickly, particularly if you're asking, you know, if it's one thing if someone is writing the check, then you have a different set of problems, or one entity is writing the check. But in most environments, at least healthy environments, you have multiple funders, stakeholders, and motivations in trying to figure out where's the magic. And that's a human process. That's why it's so hard.
John?
Yeah, I think alignment of interests. You know, if you look at, you know, our local ecosystem, I think the macroeconomic environment has impacted the Chicago area as well as the region to motivate, you know, through fear and greed. Market forces are acting upon institutions that ordinarily wouldn't collaborate. They now need to collaborate, not because it sounds good or it's optically pleasing. It's because they need to. So if you look at institutions, that can range from academic institutions that formerly didn't collaborate. They're now collaborating because as you look at NIH funding being more constrained for basic research, and as funding from the government begins to move downstream for more translational activities, and there's greater incentive by the government to collaborate amongst institutions, and yet the skill base for PhDs and faculty is not really prepared for this translational activity. We're moving through a transitional time, and so collaboration has become a necessary ingredient. So that makes for, I think, a more, it augurs and argues for what you just said, Ray, in terms of if people are motivated by the market to see that in their own self-interest they need to work together and can't claim credit, then the overall ecosystem can grow. And by virtue of the growth of the ecosystem, the individual institutions will benefit. And that's, if you focus on every aspect of the different sediments within the ecosystem, that pertains to, you know, government institutions, it pertains to entrepreneurs, it pertains to venture capitalists, it pertains to the whole community, including the corporate community. All kind of have to have that same goal because there's something in it for them at the end of the process, and there's a reason to collaborate. I think once you have those interests aligned, because having been a longtime member of that Chicago community and watched it evolve, and everyone always saying we've got all the pieces here, you know, there's no reason why we can't, you know, become a bigger cluster around innovation and entrepreneurship. What's missing here? What's the missing ingredient? And everybody would go through the list. Well, we don't have the entrepreneurs, or there's no early stage capital, or, and you know, I'm sure you've heard the same kinds of things. But what's different today, after the fits and starts along that long journey that, you know, Chicago could have, or everyone always felt like it had higher potential. The reason I feel more optimistic that it can reach that potential is largely due to these market forces that are aligning individuals, organizations, and institutions that otherwise have not been aligned in the past.
Can you ask the question again? I was getting the water. I was actually asking for the water to my colleague Nicole.
Why don't you focus on the challenges for what you're in trying to foster the innovation with CIC and Venture Café?
I mean, I think Boston is an incredibly privileged city. Cambridge and Kendall Square are incredibly privileged locations. So it is not that hard to foster collaboration because it is almost now part of the culture in that part of the city, and so is here. There is this myth that some folks here in Boston like to say that we lack the collaboration gene. I think that's ridiculous. I mean, I think, you know, you just need to not be offended if somebody doesn't say good morning to you in the morning, right? And then just reach out and talk and collaborate, and here we are. I think a challenge right now, at least from the side of the Venture Café Foundation, for example, is we do these, what I think are really important things in the precursors of the innovation process, which is creating spaces, connecting people. How do you measure that? How do you tell the story? And how do you get it the proper resources, the proper funds to do something that escapes traditional conceptions and measurements of what innovation means and how it happens? And the other challenge I think that we're very mindful of is inclusion. If you go to the Venture Café session on a Thursday, the majority of individuals are white males between probably 25 and 35-year-olds. This is not anybody's fault, but for me it's a problem. I mean, it's a problem that first of all, it's a problem in the sense that we have an obligation, I would say, to provide more opportunities to more people, to open the doors to underrepresented communities and to the very talented people that are in all of these communities that are not necessarily part of the conversation right now. And also, when we had an event here a little while ago, a coding session, just to give you an example of why this is so troubling, a coding session sponsored by a local organization that brought somebody from a foundation to teach coding to high school kids. And at some point I walked into the room and it was really shocking to see first how most of the wealthy kids were with their parents and had cool computers, and all of those who arrived a little bit late because they didn't have their own transportation and they had to wait for the bus from the Boston school systems, they got here late without teachers, without their parents and with old computers. And by the way, none of them was white, right? So there was this divide within this room that it was just, here it is why we really need to be talking in this conference about innovation and inequality, which takes many dimensions, and to make sure that as we work in this incredible subject matter, which can change the world, we make it work to increase opportunity rather than to increase inequality.
Yeah, I would say we're fortunate in the sense that, proximity to and a surrounding where you're able to visibly connect to diversity is critical. So if you've got to go out of your way to do it, it makes it a barrier. In our case, being in the middle of heavy traffic of a very diversified community with a wide disparity of incomes within this micro community that sits in the middle of this large metropolitan city, offers us a unique opportunity to be able to bring that diversity in. So making alliances with Chicago Public Schools, developing a tie to the Chicago Urban League, developing the opportunity where at street level we're inviting the community in. So Chicago Innovation Exchange is on the second floor of two 100-year-old theater buildings on 53rd Street. Very cool innovation space. And the idea is to be able to invite the community in with windows, connecting even digitally through IT across the way that we invite people to come in and engage with the Chicago Innovation Exchange. So we can do that because we're in the middle of a neighborhood where that diversity and the traffic already exists. And I think the exposure to what happens in innovation and watching what occurs when innovation is developing and businesses are being formed and individuals are communicating and developing ideas, exposure just by a high school student is transformational in many cases. And though if we can do that in a more programmatic fashion where we have opportunities to have workshops, mentoring, accelerator programs within, even at the high school level to try to move individuals in an economically impoverished area down a path of STEM education, for example, because they see someone that they can aspire to become that they would not otherwise see in their community, offers the university a way to engage with the community that it never has been able to before. There's always a struggle between this large institution, urban institution, that over the years has had kind of there's a suspicious feeling by the community. What's behind the reason that they're trying to do these things? Because it's had a tumultuous relationship with the outside community. To establish that trust, innovation and entrepreneurship cuts across all boundaries. So it's a vehicle to engage that the university really never had before. But back to my main point, I think part of it is being in the middle of that diversity and not having to conjure up that traffic and force it maybe allow certain spaces to be more amenable to being able to advance that or accelerate it.
So just a couple quick comments. When I hear innovate, I graduated from college in the 80s, started my career there. When I hear innovation, I think technology. When I think technology, I think white people, right? So what's been interesting in our work at Jumpstart, and we've been at this for 10 years, and of course everything's changing all around us culturally and in terms of our national society, is that all these barriers are breaking down, not just, because a larger percentage of the population is dealing with technology and innovation from day one, but also you're starting to get a bunch of white people who are from the technology world, who get that it's about the collective, and we're going to have to desire to be really intentional as a community in our city, in our region, to make sure that everybody is winning, everybody is gaining, and that's an intentional, specific thing that more and more traditional innovators, traditional technologists have particularly in the entrepreneurial world, have a better understanding, folks over 40 have a better understanding of the power of that. So we've created both nonprofit and for-profit funds, venture funds, focused on women and minority entrepreneurs in our work, and have had programs that have also led us to high growth, more of the ICIC, inner city, high growth, minority-owned companies as opposed to just the high-tech companies. We've also done some things very intentionally around what does it mean to recruit C-level executives into majority-owned companies to be the CFO, the VP of sales, so that they're very, very likely to be the CEO of the next company that they're leading. So it's every dimension of how do we broaden and diversify the individual participants in the ecosystem. One last thing I want to say, separate from this, that I think is really important for the audience that's related to it, that I'm very encouraged about. 10 years ago, when I thought about our work, I never thought of what are the sustainable models. I mean, I just came at this really more from the heart than the wallet and the head as a nonprofit. And just in this room alone, I'm sure we can identify 10, 20, 30 different models that have built-in self-sustainability into them, whether they're leveraging real estate, whether they're leveraging venture funds, because I do think one of the most critical issues in this work, innovation in the city, is how are we building models that out of the box are, to some degree, self-sustaining and increasingly more self-sustaining. So hopefully we'll be able to talk more about that over the next day.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up now for questions, comments. I think there's a lot of experience here. And so let me first turn to... Yeah. Okay, Teresa, you have that right, actually.